how do we leave this world in a better place than, the one we were born into? And that's what I'm trying to do, is just, educate the world and look at the world like we do with technology. We use data for everything, but when it comes to the world of construction and environmental science, material science, and construction, science, as I like to call it, just it's not being looked at. It's just not being talked about as much as it should, and that's what I'm hoping to influence and change.
Welcome to The Path to Wealth, the show about well-being, fulfillment, and financial freedom. And I'm your host, Hennche. Welcome back to The Path to Wealth. I'm your host, Hennche. In this episode, we're joined by Nolan Ausan, a seasoned developer and entrepreneur specializing in green energy and modular construction. Nolan is the founder and chief strategy officer of Rovo Industries Group, focusing on sustainable building systems. Nolan supports housing projects benefiting marginalized communities, including Native Americans and veterans. Nolan's commitment to designing affordable housing models, mentoring aspiring entrepreneurs, and philanthropy is evident in his values of giving back and making the world a better place. Thank you for taking the time today, Nolan.
Thanks for having me, sir.
Of course. So tell us a little bit more about what you're trying to achieve with Rovo and where do you see the opportunity with what you're doing there? And obviously this is a lot to unpack, so feel free to start anywhere you want.
Sure. So it's it came from a kind of a culmination of my experiences as a production engineer, tech space, and being a developer and builder, and kind of seeing, what has kind of taken place, over the course of time. I had kind of two stints in construction, right, in terms of growing up with it with my dad on a small scale, and then going out and building a company in that space. And it was really the most staggering thing that happened between those two experiences was the difference in quality and just the attitude in terms of work ethic, in the trades, right? And so that was a big driver behind it. And how do we continue to meet the needs of our ever growing planet from a housing standpoint, right? And so that's really what we're trying to really kind of unpack, right? Is try to figure out what's that path forward, right? Much like Ford has built a production line of how they automate and build vehicles, right? And Tesla has kind of came in and kind of even taken that to a whole nother level, right? So we're trying to take some of those same fundamentals and apply that to the world of construction, so that there's a really fine balance between what can be automated and produced at volume, right, using a kit of parts, so that you can still create a semi-custom building, but standardizing aspects of that from design to completion, right, or from concept to completion, as we like to say. And so that's really what we're trying to bring to the market. And we're leveraging a lot of really interesting technologies. One of the key things that we're focusing on right now is we're actually going to be separating the software piece of our company into its own company, turning it into its own software as a service company. Because one of the biggest issues in the world of construction is how things are communicated at every layer of the path, from the time you start, hey, we're going to start this, we're thinking about starting this project at this location, to the time you actually start the work on the project, and even through the ongoing process. There's a lot of different personalities and avatars of people that are involved in each of those steps of the process. And the communication is really this back and forth, method, primarily through email communication and some minimal data sharing. And sometimes they're using some applications to kind of check the progress of the jobs and things like that once it gets there. But how that actually gets there from a design and engineering standpoint is very disjointed between all the different things, right? You have, maybe you've got an architect that's working in one piece of software, right? Well, now you've got a mechanical or structural engineer working in a totally another piece of software. So at every stage, they have to essentially recreate the structure in whatever environment they're in, right? And every time you do that, people, we're human, right? We all make, errors and mistakes, and we misinterpret things, right? And so that leads to issues and challenges, not only during that process, but that's what happens during the complexity of a commercial, especially a commercial construction project, where, maybe you're building a a 5, 10, 20 story building, whatever the size of the project is, right? Even when you're dealing with it, even on a single family houses, much like what I dealt with when I was building single family houses, every project has its own set of challenges and things. And if you just set up the roadmap on the front end of the project and everybody follows that same roadmap and process and procedure, allow them to interpret what needs to be interpreted, but work from the same software, work from the same system, work from the same collaborative environment. Now it makes it so much easier, right? And so then our software piece becomes kind of a digital storefront for us from the factory standpoint, because now it's say, hey, I need this kit of parts made, right? And how do you want that kit of parts delivered? Is it a full volumetric module? Great, fantastic. If you need it maybe in a panelized product, great. Maybe that works better for this project. Maybe you need another just different set of kit of parts, or maybe you need a hybrid strategy or combination of those things, right? And by allowing, building in a complete ecosystem around what those capacities are, allows us to really look at it from a totally different perspective than, what the industry is looking at today.
It's a little bit like a developer's platform. Like you have an app where people can start building on top of each other, and you layer in different values in there. Like, for example, you can send them different kits, you can make different suggestions, and it's probably also very streamlined. It sounds like there is more efficiency. There's a less room for error because we're staying in the same tool, and which probably leads to a lot better cost too.
Yeah. And we're setting a lot of those checkpoints, right? You're answering a lot of those questions that need to be asked on every project, regardless of what it is, on the front end, right? And you're kind of creating, it's like going to a bowling alley and putting up the bumpers, right? You go out, you don't ever have to worry about getting in the gutter, because you're always kind of staying in the lane, because we're setting that up, and we're bringing the tool sets and using AI to check some of the math and things like that to present it to the user, right? Ultimately the users are still responsible for, it's good data in, good data out, right? But if you're using the tool correctly, you're going to get a much more streamlined process, because it's not requiring everybody to start over from scratch every time they get to their part of it. Or let's say the architect starts designing a building, right? And then get to the structural engineer, it starts getting further in. Oh, and they realize that, hey, there's an architectural issue there, or architectural change we got to make. Well, guess what? That whole process has to start over again. If you've connected all those things in a chain, from a technology standpoint, you make one change, it knows how to make those adjustments for you without having to start that process over. So taking what could take, weeks and months to do from a design and engineering standpoint, becomes hours and minutes, and at worst, maybe a week or two to complete fairly complex projects. And that's where we feel we're going with this.
Yeah. This just reminded me of a conversation I heard this week. This was more in relationship, for example, to making projects like SpaceX happen, which back in the days, NASA would take a decade, 15 years, 20 years to kind of conceptualize something, actually work through the process, and then launch an execution of a mission. And with the compute power that we're getting, basically we can build physics into code and kind of with brute force computing get to these plans and goals and a lot faster. And at the same time, for example, like building codes is something that you can probably beautifully layer into a language model, which allows you to make sense of it right then and there, and you see where you might have potential objections.
Yep. Yeah, and we could even apply it at a local level, right? Because yes, we have one code book for commercial construction. We have one code book for commercial construction. Same with all the trades for mechanical, electrical, plumbing, HVAC, all of those things, right? But every local municipality, state and regional municipality, mainly state and local for the most part, all interpret that code based on a code year, or may interpret specific codes differently, right? And so by allowing us to bring those data sets in, and again setting those boundaries up front and saying, hey, this is how the code is interpreted now. Does this apply to this case, or does this need to be adjusted, right? So again, allowing that input from the user to say, okay, no, it needs to be. A good example is PEX plumbing versus copper plumbing. Some municipalities will support it, some won't, even though it's in the code book, right? It's just a matter of what's allowed. So you just kind of go through that checks and balances process on the front end, and then it just eliminates all those issues on the, as you get further into the project.
Yeah. So how much do you think you can accelerate the process of, for example, a multifamily community? Like, how much time can you shave off the development, the planning, to actually get there with a tool like Rovo?
Yeah. So, on the software side, I truly feel you're taking something that, architecturally could take, weeks and months to do, depending on the complexity of that project. And you're taking that down to hours and days to on that side. Outside of, the one piece we will never control is the process from, a zoning and plan approval standpoint. But, just from a pure construction standpoint, once we have, our integrated factory system, again, tied into what we're doing from a software standpoint, we feel like we're going to take, most multifamily projects are taking, anywhere from 12 to 24 months plus, right? And we're looking at a turnkey completion within anywhere from 5 to 9 months in most cases, depending on what the what the lead time is from the production side. But that's the other advantage of having, it's easy to turn things on and turn things off when you've got a production environment that has the capacity to scale up and scale down very quickly, versus, you're simply just deploying a whole bunch of resources to a job site, and you're, sending a bunch of materials that's got to be sorted out on a job site. That's all, you're eliminating all of those issues, right? You're eliminating all the trash and all the bottlenecks of things that happen on site that, just it kind of streamlines that whole process. It's a lot more organized from the front end. And when you have the ability to organize it from a digital standpoint, and you can showcase the workflow, exactly what needs to happen at every step, and show that to the work from, whether you're the architect, the builder, the developer, or the guy literally on the ground working, show them that process, in kind of a video, format, or kind of a workflow format for them. It makes it a lot easier for them to understand what's actually taking place, right? They're not looking at some 2D set of prints and, trying to line up, serial numbers on this truss versus this wall, and, all of these various, numbers and codes and all the things that they have that they're trying to sort through a bunch of paperwork. It's done with QR codes and in your phone if you're not sure, right? It's just there's things that we can do to provide some intelligence to this.
And it sounds like you can even layer in the most basic. Let's say there's actually a construction worker who's doing something in a particular corner, and he could go into that QR code of that particular task if there's any unclarity, and double check what's to do.
Right.
So there's which is just another layer of efficiency, because he has faster feedback, faster response time on what he needs to do. So instead of like lingering till maybe his superior comes, he actually can like, okay, this makes sense. I know how to do this. I can proceed here.
Yeah, and another great use case to what we're doing too, and what our plan is for once we get to, having a factory setting, right? So we're going to 3D scan every layer, right? So every step during the assembly of every component that goes into our building system, regardless of how far it goes in the factory or not, all of that is going to be scanned into a digital system, so that you can go, everything will get tagged with a QR code. So it's a digital asset at that point. And you can basically, with the slide of your finger on your phone, you'll be able to kind of go from the beginning to the end of that timeline very quickly, and you can see all those layers. So that's another way of, showing code, code inspectors and inspection standpoint, what's there, because every layer, every time there's a change in that component or that process during that, through the production phase, we're going to be able to showcase that. It's a lot of data that we're going to have to store to do that, but we see a lot of value in being able to do that, because that's going to allow us to always ensure that we've got a, high quality product going out the door.
The more I hear you listening, it sounds a bit like we're looking at the Gigafactory version for housing, and
just on a much smaller scale, right? We're not talking we're not talking a $6 billion factory, right? Yeah. We're talking a fraction of that in comparison, but being able to kind of populate those one at a time to fit the market fit and need as we grow, right? First step first is we want to, get the first one built, work through all the kinks that are always inherently in the first one, right? And, improve upon that. And that becomes kind of a showcase model for, how we go, help others around the world build these, right? And that's really what this is it's a kind of like the McDonald's franchise model. Or from a standpoint in simplistic terms, that's really what we're trying to do, right? Is we're trying to make it simple and easy for people to be a part of construction, participate in this industry, just take the pain points out of the equation, right? And, are we going to be perfect every single time? No, but I feel like we can do a whole lot better than, what the industry is doing now. Are we going to be the best? I don't claim to be, but I think once we get, through the levels of maturity of what we can accomplish, it's just a matter of blocking and tackling and getting the job done.
Yeah. And again, this is something that is improved with iterations. Like, for example, today, Starship 3 lifted. And, the first time everybody's mocking the rocket. And now it's the 5,000-ton rocket that actually left Earth, went into orbit, and it's traveling. And they knew with the first one, it's about reiterations. It's like,
Yep.
Okay, we have to collect data. We have to learn here. This might or might not blow up, If we can get it on the ground, great. If it falls down, great. Whatever we learn, we can learn and build on that. And I think this is where success is headed. No, like.
Yeah, I love that analogy because in comparison, this isn't rocket science, right? This is construction, right? I mean, you're dealing with something that's a whole lot more complex in comparison, right, to what we're doing. And that's really what we're trying to do is we're just, looking at everything objectively and like, how do we solve this problem, right? You just kind of keep, putting the pegs on the wall until you kind of, until you run out of pegs essentially. And that's really what we're doing is just focusing on the key aspects of, 3 or 4 items at 3 to 5 things at a time. And we're just being laser focused on how we solve for those problems. And that's what we're doing with our software. And that's what we're also doing, from the factory standpoint as well.
How do you size the market? You did mention maybe franchising it out into the other countries potentially. But from a US perspective, we have a massive housing shortage in terms of the projections for the next couple of years. And as you mentioned earlier, like the delivery time on multifamily housing is multiple years from like inception till actual delivery,
Yep.
including the land process, zoning and everything. This can be like a 3 to 5 year process.
Right.
So we're seeing, because of the interest rates, we're seeing not a lot of projects being started right now. We're seeing kind of the tail end on the delivery of the cheap interest rates. So we will have kind of really solid inventory adding, but then there will be like a shortage again because
Right.
there's no additional inventory build.
Right.
Where do you see your opportunity there?
Yeah, and that's kind of the beauty of part of the beauty of also what we'll be able to accomplish because from a hard cost standpoint, we're probably going to be pretty competitive in the marketplace, right? I mean, if you're building a $250 a square foot product in X market, you're probably building the same $250 X product. Now I feel like we're providing a much higher quality product and more value for that. But when you look at it just from a financial perspective, the holding just in soft costs, like your financing costs and all your holding costs during that time, if you can cut your holding costs in half, that may be the difference of a go or no go on a project, right? The difference of making something profitable or not being profitable. And that's where we feel like the real advantage comes in is that we can, speed to deployment. And you can also do more of a segmented deployment also, right? You don't have to, build everything at once, right? Because obviously when you're doing a traditional construction project, it's a lot easier to keep boots on the ground for for a stand up, gear up and gear down standpoint, going through that process. But when you're looking at a system like ours, right, you can maybe scale that project, break it into more phases because, the time period to get more product from us, especially after we already have it, through the design engineering and all the procedures internally, once obviously when we don't have the factory live now, but once we get to that point, you'll be able to, call us and say, hey, we're ready for phase 2, we're ready for phase 3, right? And you can kind of align the project with the true market need, not only on a city regional level, but on an actual project level, which I think is unique in itself.
Yeah. So where do you think housing development construction is broken as it is of right now? And there's also already a component of modular. And where do you think, I mean, you already touched up on it, but where do you think you will basically leave that old school construction in the dust?
Yeah, I mean the way we build things today, we've gotten to this, we've got to, and the market has kind of forced everybody to be the lowest cost provider for everything, right? And unfortunately, that it inherently has created some quality issues, has created environmental issues. We're also looking at total cost of ownership of a project, right? I'm looking at, okay, what's my energy efficiency on this building, right? If I can cut energy efficiency, if I can cut my energy consumption on this building, by 10, 30, 10, 20, 30, 40%, just by making some changes of how we do things, right? There's a lot of value in that because you're operating your OPEX expense, especially with where we're going from utility expenses, right? It's skyrocketing, right? We were seeing dramatic changes in climate change, and that's requiring more heat in the winter and more cooling time in the summer, right? There's a huge expense to that. So we're also looking at it from that standpoint as well. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of how we kind of look at it.
Yeah, I think so too. Especially if you look at the utility and the operational cost. And this is something that it's similar with car ownership. For a long time, it wasn't factored in. Like
Right.
people wouldn't factor in how much the gallon of gas costs because it was so cheap that it didn't make the major difference. But now prices in between have fluctuated a lot. We're down a little bit back. So, but people got a little bit more conscious. I'm like, okay, maybe it shouldn't be a V8. Maybe a Toyota Prius actually sounds like a good idea. And,
Right.
and I think applying that to housing makes perfect sense, especially if this can be, ideally, the government would kind of give some guidelines and be like, hey, this kind of building code. And I come from a country, for example, in Germany, I think they're overdoing it. The building code is so stringent and ahead. They're trying to save the world and they have like not even 1% of the world's emissions, But you're basically close to passive houses, so which barely need heating and barely need cooling. But I think in the US, if let's say you can just improve the average housing by 5%, that's massive amount of energy savings.
Right. Exactly. That's what we look at it, and so it's really utilizing data, in this space, right, in ways that frankly isn't being even talked about. I mean, it's being talked about, but it's not really being applied at scale, and that's where we feel like we're really trying to be really cognizant. We're looking at the material sciences of things. We're looking through the energy consumption. We're looking at different ways and different materials, and how do we improve the construction process, but also improve the outcome, from an environmental standpoint. Let's face it, we spend probably 60% of our lives in the houses that we live in, right? And, we don't do a very good job, in my opinion, of, filtering and accounting for the environmental aspects of things. I don't have specific data, but I mean, it seems like, we're getting to a point where, asthma, like my son, has asthma, right? And so I'm more cognizant of it just because I'm experiencing that in our own place, right? And so, taking more ownership of route, the filter is, air ventilation and things, all of those factors that need to go into a building, right? Most builders and developers, I mean, not that they don't, it's no knock on them. It's just not how they're trained. It's not how they're thought of, right? And so we're just trying to take a more holistic approach to, how we can, help our environment, and that's really what we look at.
Yeah, there's also the component, for example, what you said earlier about in some places, you have to have copper pipes. In others, it's fine to have like PVC plastic. I saw a study in Nature just recently being released that the amount of microplastic in black within people's body is like accumulating at a major pace. And those are things that are like, I think sometimes we don't, like, for example, back in the days, people thought it was a great idea to use asbestos. And they especially in Eastern Germany and many of the Soviet countries, it was used just about anywhere.
Yep.
and tons of people had really bad health outcomes based on that. And I think those are always things where we have to adapt and kind of learn from that. Like, okay, what kind of building materials actually enhance the health span and quality of life of people?
Definitely. That's what really drives it for me, is like, how do we, actually, especially after my son being born, right? You kind of look at the world with a totally different perspective, right? Is like, how do we leave this world in a better place than, the one we were born into? That's part of one of the phrases I put in one of our videos that I put out. And, it's something that I take very seriously about, what we're doing. And that's what I'm trying to do, is just, educate the world. And, let's look at the world like we do with, like technology. We use data for everything related to everything technology. We probably overanalyze things from a technology perspective. But when it comes to the world of construction and environmental science, material science, and construction, science, as I like to call it, it's not being looked at. It's just not being talked about as much as it should. And that's what I'm hoping to influence and change.
Yeah. So what are some of the next milestones that you have to accomplish to actually kind of deploy this on a meaningful scale?
Yeah, so we've got, now that we're separating the software company into its own company, we're going to start raising capital for that specifically. So that's that process is we're starting that right now. We've built what I feel is a phenomenal team around that. I've honestly surpassed my expectations in terms of, the team that we were able to, bring to the table for that side of the house. So I'm really, really excited about that. So that's something we're definitely working on. So if anybody out there has interest in learning more about that, certainly love to have a conversation with you on that. And then, once we want to build a little more maturity in the software side, because we feel like without the software in place, it's really hard to drive the production side, right? You really need the digital side to drive what we're trying to do from a production standpoint, because that's another key aspect that's totally missing in the world, is how you actually take something from the CAD world and you put it into the CAM world, and from a technical standpoint. So basically from, the design to the production side is the layman side of doing that, right? And how you automate that process. Because right now, if you actually want to, we'll take Ford Motor Company, for example, right? When Ford puts a Ford F-150 down the line, they're building the exact same thing every single day, right? That robot does the exact same function, right? It's basically statically programmed and maybe changed once a year, maybe twice a year in terms of tweaks, right? It's turned on, it goes. Well, that doesn't work in the world of construction, because everything is going to have a size and shape and scale that things are going to happen, right? You're going to have, every project is going to have a different window and door location, right? We can set up segments of walls for 4, 6, 8, and, set up increments, but those are changes that have to be, adapted to every project based on those requirements. And so in order for it to drive the robotic side of it, you've got to put some intelligence to that so that the robot knows what to do. It's a dynamic environment. It has to be able to adjust on the fly. Right now, in the robotics, we call that, and get a little technical here, it's called, I call it it's called G code. I call it Go code. So the Go code for the robots has to be essentially programmed. And today, that there's really not a software system that I've seen to date that is effectively doing that very well in terms of interpreting building data into production data. So there's a lot of manual coding that is happening from an engineering standpoint to make those things work, right? So essentially all you've done is you've taken, people off the workforce, off the factory floor, and you've tripled their expense and put them in an office to do programming. Oh, and by the way, you also paid a robot to do it. Right. So where is the efficiency gain there? Right. That's where there's a cutoff. Like, that's obviously where we want to go with this. But I appreciate everybody that's put a lot of effort in and done some really cool things out there. But that is a bottleneck in this industry. And that's why the adoption of automation has not taken off as much, in my opinion. Why it has not taken off is because nobody has figured out how to solve that problem. And the advantage that we have now is we've got an AI engine we've got available to us that's and we've got some really cool ways that we're going to do from a digital delivery model that just wasn't available previously. And that's where we feel we've got to focus on that first. And once we get the little maturity with that, then we're going to still look at other opportunities. We're we're still exploring opportunities in New Jersey and other markets to look for that first factory location. We originally thought we were going to build that in Omaha, and I'm so glad we didn't, because, we quickly realized coming out of that, opportunity that we were, kind of overlooking this. I mean, we knew about it, was a part of our plan as a part of building the factory, but we really started to focus on realizing what we had in our hands, which is, this massive opportunity from a digital standpoint on the software and AI architecture side.
Mm-hmm. This to some degree. So you remember how Tesla initially tried to do the FSD to self-driving through hard code, right? They basically try to solve it by coding it into every possibility. And eventually they realize that they will miss the corner cases. They will get 99% right. Yep. They will miss the corner cases, which eventually will lead to accidents that might be deadly. So they changed the approach. And what they're doing now is they're using all of the real data that's coming back, and they're training the model on video. So the car doesn't really know that the stop sign is a stop sign. It's not hard coded, but they're basically using it in such a way like, okay, all of the best drivers that are rated as safe, when they see this red thing, is the STOP, they stop. So they're using these massive amounts of data that are being fed from the Teslas and using that to train the full self-driving. And it seems to be a lot more organic. I wonder if, obviously this takes a lot of compute and it's a completely different level of expense there. But I wonder if something similar could be applied to a factory. But I wonder how you could aggregate that amount of data to actually make sense of this.
We're going to be using 3D LiDAR scanners to kind of, watch what watch all the components that are being fed onto the table systems that are being essentially manipulated by the robots, right? And they're also checking the work, right? So, we're going to keep, tracking and, keep that data because that's obviously the data that we're going to use to also use for quality assurance down the line. So there's a lot of different ways that we're going to store that data and use that, and probably ways we haven't even thought of at this point. But that's really kind of what we're trying to do, is we're also going to try to use that to kind of use that data to train a language model of sorts. That's really my CTO's expertise, but that's kind of what we're kind of envisioning is, ultimately we're going to become as much of a data company as we are a, construction, design and factory at some point. So,
yeah. This is kind of where you suddenly find that the value is not anywhere close to what you had in the original idea.
Yeah.
And you're finding yourself almost in a different value proposition, a different business model.
Yeah. And, haven't realized all that potential. Like, we've designed our entire system from a factory standpoint. We've got, the partners ready to execute that, when we're ready to make that jump. We want to see things turn around from an interest rate standpoint. I think get past this next crazy, election cycle that is just, causing, I think, a lot of anxiousness in a lot of different people for a lot of different reasons. I'm trying not to read into it too much. I mean, at the end of the day, people got to live somewhere, right? So, we're going to keep moving forward and seeing where things go.
I mean, there is already a big housing shortage. We have constant inflow into the country, whether it's legal or illegal. We will have millions of people that are looking for an affordable home here in the future.
Oh, definitely. I mean, what are we going to do with all these immigrants that are coming here? Like, I don't care what anybody says, no matter what policy. I don't care. I just try to stay out of politics, but they're going to find jobs. They're going to end up going somewhere, right? And when your average mortgage right now is, $2,600 a month across the country, and, apartments are averaging about $1,000 less, where are they going to go until that changes in terms of, we keep getting this grandiose thing, like we got to build these massive houses, like, we're trying to keep up with the Joneses all the time. Like, we got to start looking at what people are doing around the world and saying, look, I understand we don't want to be like piled on top of each other, but do we really need this much space, right? Maybe there's smarter ways to use space, right? Use functional, a good example is like, look at these, apartments that have these, you'd be able to basically transform a room just by having movable walls and things like that. It goes from being a bedroom to a living room, right? Well, there's 300 square feet you just got back. Well, multiply that by $250 a foot plus the cost of time, heat, efficiency over the whole time. Wow, we get way more out of this. And to me, I think it's beautiful if you do it right. And so that's what we got to look at, right? We got to think about, what's the true need of what we're doing, right? We can't keep doing what we're doing and expect a better result. And that's what I feel like there's a whole lot of opportunity across the board.
Where I think as a European is a major issue in like the outside of the major metropolitan areas like New York, maybe. Like, for example, the density of San Francisco is nowhere close to the density of Barcelona. Barcelona mainly has 6-floor buildings. So it's not that need to be massive skyscrapers. And I think Barcelona has a pretty good quality of life. It's very walkable. You have good public transportation, which means a lot of the people don't need cars, which leads to less traffic, less congestion, which means less wasted lifetime, just higher quality of life.
Pollution.
Less pollution. So there's all of those components where I feel like there's a lot of tier 2 cities that are being built in a very ineffective way where space isn't utilized well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very spread out, which causes large distances, which causes a lot of traffic, which causes bigger highways. And, if you were to build a public transit system, it would cost billions, so nobody does it.
Yeah, I mean, and the other big thing that's happening now is look at the I think we're and we're starting to see this a little bit. I mean, look at the office space conversions, right? We're going to these co-working spaces, right? It's kind of funny how WeWork almost was like a decade too early. I mean, if WeWork would have started right around when COVID happened, boy, I think their outlook on the world would be entirely different right now, because you're building these multi-purpose buildings or repurposing these buildings, and I think that's what we've got to look at is people are changing the way people are working far more remotely than they ever have, right? So, you got to think about how do you accommodate them not having to travel, right? And employers should love it because, that's maybe an hour, maybe two in some cases of commute that people get back. They get a better quality of life. You're going to get higher productivity out of people. You got to find other ways to track it from policy procedure standpoint. But regardless, that's a huge amount of time. It's 10 hours, potentially 10 hours a week or more that people are going to get back. I understand why people want to work remotely after they've experienced it. You obviously don't get the same feel of, being in a work environment, but maybe you create that kind of hybrid environment or allow multiple people to go to a remote, pop-up remote office day, right? And you create these remote office extensions. There's just so many things that you can do that, are going to feed into the market, the market of the future versus, again, just keep putting these high rises up or whatever and expecting that people are going to want to continue to live in that way or continue building these massive houses that nobody can afford. I mean, that's really what it comes down to.
I actually think multifamily developers really picked up on the trend well, and by building like shared community spaces where they have printers and where they can work from. So you kind of have the choice between either having another room in your apartment, working remotely. You can also go into that shared space. Maybe it gives you a different feel to like actually leaving your apartment and going to work, but you're still staying within the community. And then you can pair that with, for example, what you mentioned. You can go to one of those clustered offices or the main office every other day.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
I think all of those improve the quality of life. And again, it takes cars off the street. It improves just less congestion, less pollution. And I always look at like commute is kind of lost time. Like if I run the math of it, I like to look at the whole year. I'm like, okay, if I'm commuting 20 minutes versus 40 minutes, and then you multiply that throughout the whole year, I think most people don't realize that they're giving up weeks of their year in traffic.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So I that's what I look at as how do we accommodate the needs of the future? We obviously got to focus on what the needs are today, but we've got to certainly keep an eye out what's coming down the pike in terms of what we need to be delivering for an environmental standpoint, for living spaces, and creating the communities like this built-in ecosystem of sorts, right? So people don't have to go as far to do things, and I think that's just more of what we need to have. It definitely as a whole in this country, and I think there's a lot of you're going to start seeing a lot of that start to change as we kind of continue to move things forward.
Yeah. Well, Nolan, this has been super interesting. Where can people connect with you, find out about what's coming up? You did mention you're raising capital at this point. I hope it's a 5 or 6B or something.
Yeah. So we've got, you can reach out to me through LinkedIn. That's usually the best way to connect. I'm on there frequently. Easy to find me, Nolan Ausan. Otherwise, certainly can email me. That's my first and last, nolan.ausan@rovosmart.com. And so happy to reach out to me there. But yeah, I would definitely encourage you to reach out to me on LinkedIn.
Nice. And one of my favorite questions at the end is, what do you consider a life well lived?
I consider a life well lived. That's a really great question. To me, it's leaving a legacy for future generations to not only survive but thrive. And I think we're really at a point where we've really got to take some self-assessment as a whole and make that happen. And that's what's really going to come down to making this world a better place. Is what impact can I make to not only for my son and in future generations, but everybody as a whole. And that's really what I look at as a life well lived.
Yeah, I love that. Nolan, thank you so much for making the time. I really appreciate it. And thank you.
Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us at The Path to Wealth. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Check out our upcoming guests and be sure to share it with all your friends and family that want to take their life to the next level of wealth.